Well, hello, Herbies. Mike Timms back again, and we're going to look at the political history of herbal medicine in the U.S. And before you end up um, running, screaming from the room, thinking this is going to be really boring, I'm going to ask you to be patient with it because it's good to know where we've come from to understand where we're going. So let's start. Um, we're going to have two parts again with a discussion break. The first part, we're going to look at the history of herbal use in the U.S. And we're going to use golden seal as a sample plant to track some of the various concerns that evolved, where use came from. It's a way of giving specificity to a story. The second part will be a look at the political machinations that led to our current medical model, and then what right to practice looks like in the contemporary landscape. So early herbal practitioners in the U.S. Were European-based, British Isles, and they brought their own plants. And difficult to get that. It took a long time to order a bunch of plants. So that drove a number of decisions. Women were primary caregivers and herbalists within these communities. And so the need for currently available plants led them to adopt a lot of indigenous plants and practices from Native Americans and their tradition. What came with that was not only the plants and practices, but a tradition that was rich both in systematic approaches and the materia medica. In most cases, it would probably be an oral history rather than a written history of plant use, how it was used, what it was used for. Another additional piece that was very interesting in our history was the slave population of African Americans really had to provide their own health care within their own communities. And they had also brought over a lot of their own seeds and plants. In this case, though, as they continued to plant and set up their own systems, settlers actually borrowed from them as well. And their plant diaspora is now part of the American landscape. So everything from food-based, from okra to rice to watermelon to a number of different peas. These are all products of the African diaspora, and a number of medicinal plants as well, such as the cayennes and some of the mucilage-rich plants. So the idea of using golden seal as a sample plant, native use of golden seal, and if you look, this really details a lot of our own current use of the plant as an insect repellent, as a diuretic, wound healing topical, a wash for sores and inflamed eyes, and also as a dye. And you can see the beautiful rhizome, these active meristem areas, and very simple plant, a flower. In the colonial period, what we had is we had regulars that were educated in British universities. These would be our medical practitioners, universities and medical schools. And we also had herbalists, or what were called root doctors, that had no formal training. They were either self-taught or apprenticed. These herbalists and root doctors were probably much more open and adept at pulling in from other traditions. The herbalists were protected from prosecution by regular doctors by a legal charter that was established by Henry VIII. But there was an ongoing animosity between these two groups. So there's a long history of this going on in the U.S. The regulars practiced what was called heroic medicine. They used both herbs and chemicals. And some of the chemicals we're talking about are arsenic and mercury and gold and some things that are actually useful, but a lot of things that were awfully toxic. And they were very dramatic in their use. So they had emetics, things that would make you throw up. Opiates had tremendous effect on the body, bloodletting, and their approach really, they were counteracting poisons because they considered the poisons to be a causative agent for most disease. And at the time, this was considered science-based. And I think this is important because we know there are limits to what science can tell us about wellness and healing, even today. And that's why we look at both science and traditional approaches to help create new knowledge. But this same limitation based on what was known existed back then as well. But the regulars had a professional identity that really led to legal recognition and licensure. This licensure piece becomes an increasingly important piece as we move along throughout U.S. history. So early in the 1800s, as we move out of that colonial periods and we come into a more expansive part of the U.S. history, Thompsonian movement. These were followers of Samuel Thompson, who were considered root doctors. They had adopted many of the same heroic techniques of the regulars, but they had also borrowed from Native Americans. So they brought in diaphoretics, things that would make you sweat, astringents, emetics, and sedatives. And they were well known for something called composition powder, which had bayberry, hemlock, ginger, cayenne, and clove. And if you have to think about the diseases of the day, really they were trying to fight bacterially based epidemics, that populations that were moving and in close quarters and often pretty dire conditions would end up facing. So these would be things like typhoid, fever, influenza, yellow fever, measles, whooping cough, malaria. Now the thing about the Thompsonians as a whole is that their principles became very rigid and they were very anti-intellectual. So they were very much against what science was bringing to the table. Things like bacteriology, understanding cleanliness conditions that might have influenced the very diseases they were facing. And this becomes a theme somewhat. And I think it's important as herbalists to be open to new knowledge, new ways of seeing things, and to be integrators, to integrate pieces of information that come from various sections of the intellectual landscape. As we moved into mid-1800s, this is the Andrew Jackson era. This was a great era of egalitarianism that helped the people's medicine flourish because there was an ethic of the time celebrating personal autonomy and responsibility, very much a connection to nature and believing in the healing power of nature. And there was this growth of skepticism about the regulars, or allopathic therapeutics. And this tended to flourish in the rural areas and on the frontier. This is a great period of expansion on the national continent. And so you found sort of deep divides among frontier practitioners versus those practitioners that you might have found in a highly developed city like Philadelphia or Boston or New York or Chicago. And the latter part of that century and into the early 1900s, there was a rise of a group called the Eclectics. They had a golden age at the end of the 1800s, and they had numerous sects, but they too became somewhat rigid. They missed opportunities to incorporate the new fields of bacteriology and pharmacognosy. Pharmacognosy is still active today. It's really the knowledge of medicines that source from natural products. It involves a number of testing for compounds, identification. You were able to look at animal trials, things like that. And they believed they discovered all active ingredients, and they were known for a resinoid craze, that the active, most of the important actives were found in the resins. I think this really speaks more to the limits of their extraction ability to some extent and their willingness to be open to a broader range of phytochemicals. And this links back again to our discussion in the coevolution of plants and humans. One of the telling doctrines that we seem to have experienced over time is a reduction in our exposure to a rich, diverse level of phytochemicals. And this comes from really that rigidity of intellectual approach. So I'm going to say, let's not get rigid. But the eclectics did have a very powerful legacy. And what they did is they reintroduced a number of native herbs that we find in use today, such as echinacea, golden seal, wild indigo, black cohosh. And they had a legacy of proven clinical medicine, where they'd gone out, they'd recorded both the diagnostic approaches as well as the effects, dosing. They were very engaged and active clinicians who recorded it. And they created a wonderful set of materia medica, diagnostics, and specific indication in texts from Ellingwood, King, Felter, Scudder, and Jones, to name the biggies. These are all available on both in our library and electronically in digital form on Henrietta's Herbal pages, which you should find links to. And it's really useful to go back and look at these old eclectics, both for the language they use that is limiting, such as the understanding of what's happening in the body, also the limiting piece in terms of understanding the chemistry, but they actually did do a lot of good in terms of understanding what were some of the indications that you might need to identify a particular plant to use. So I would urge you all to get into the eclectic texts. There's still a lot to learn there. So as a golden seal now, in this early 20th century, colonial early 20th century, some of the things that stood out was Barton had noted that it was a powerful bitter. Now this is a European tradition that we find in our own American materia medica, is that we do use a lot of different bitters. It was used as an eye and mouthwash. It became an official drug in the U.S. Pharmacopoeia in 1830. And King, one of the eclectics, provides the first comprehensive clinical use in 1852. And this is something that ends up influencing the eclectics that followed him. But the thing is, at the height of the eclectic movement, the price in golden seal went up, and you begin to found economic adulterants. These would be plants that were much less expensive, but once you ground it up into a powder, had a similar golden yellow hue. And so you would find things like Coptis, Xanthorrhiza, Peony jeffersonian. These would all be mixed up and sold as golden seal. Now some of these have berberines in them or similar isoquinoline alkaloids, which make up a majority of the active constituents in golden seal. And certainly none of these are highly toxic plants, but yet they weren't the golden seal that they were being purported to be. But golden seal ended up also being adapted by allopaths and was found in the USP, and drug companies began to manufacture products. And these were used in official medicine until about 1960. So some of those pharmaceutical products you have, look at the manufacturers, Squibb, Park Davis, Lilly Thayer. These are all pharmaceutical companies that have a long history. Squibb actually used the root in whole or powdered form, and they also offered pure hydrastine as well. Park Davis had fluid and solid extract and compound formulas in pill and tablet form. Lilly had a standardized extract to about 9 to 11% of ether-soluble alkaloids. Now the ether piece is a little disturbing, obviously, but we use some pretty harsh chemicals in our medicine in the early 1900s and late 1800s. Thayer had wine and fluid extracts of golden seal. So you can see that this was a plant that was very much in commerce. Now, one of the things that changed the landscape at the very end of the eclectic movement was something called the Flexner Report. This is in 1910. There was a fledgling American Medical Association, AMA, and they used Rockefeller and Carnegie money. Both these were major industrialists in the U.S. landscape during that time, and they had foundations. and they hired Abraham Flexner to study the current state of medical schools. And the outcome of this was that the report provided the medical validity for science-based allopathic training. And in doing that, it ended up giving control of practices and licensing to the AMA. So this is a very big turning point that pushed allopathic medicine to the forefront and really created the landscape for a lot of the medical practices that alternative medicine is emerging from. And this whole group of allopathic physicians were antagonistic to this non-scientific medicine. This is the same regulars versus root doctors history that we see coming to the forefront. But some of what the remnants of this report and the changes that were forced through legislation occurred was you had medical schools that were offering alternative training had to drop that training, and many of them ended up going out of business. They began to limit admissions to only males. If you remember, women were, by and large, predominant force in that root doctor community. The capital-intensive requirements of a hospital and a medical school model appealed to these foundations like Rockefeller's and Carnegie's, and also to investors. So it became a capital market-intensive project where people could make money off of it. And this same allopathic process was much more amenable to patent and trade protection. So again, driven by monetary concerns. Now, within this, Golden Seal sort of fell off the landscape at the end of the 1950s. But in 1970s, in the early part of that period, Back to Eden was a book that was published and had a very large influence. It harkened back to Thomsonians, less so to the eclectics. But that emergence of medicinal plants from that book gave way to other indigenous knowledge, from native traditions to traditional Chinese medicine to revival in the eclectic movement. And by the 1990s in Golden Seal, the price had risen again, in part to its erroneous use to negate illicit drug testing. So John Scudder, who had been one of the eclectics, was also a novelist, and he wrote a novel about hiding cocaine use from drug testing through the use of Golden Seal. And I had a health food store throughout the 80s and 90s, and we would see people appearing in the store just buying huge amounts of Golden Seal, and you knew they weren't our regular customers. And we had Golden Seal going up to $150 a pound. And this put, again, a lot of pressure where you started to see adulterants coming into the Golden Seal market. So you had Coptis again, Xanthorrhiza, Mahonia, Collodium majus, and Berberis species. And an additional piece that began to emerge was conservation issues, that Golden Seal, like a lot of these Appalachian-based plants, grow in mesocoforest environments. And those are fragile environments. As we began to have habitat loss with development in these areas, we began to see loss of populations of plants like Golden Seal. United Plant Savers emerged out of this same issue. So this became an issue that we didn't have to face early in our medicinal plant history. So we've had a brief history of the medicinal plant use in the U.S. And so at this point, what we're asking you to do in this discussion is to go out and locate your herb. So you've chosen an herb at this point. To locate that herb in the marketplace, and ideally in at least 3 different forms. This can be a tincture, a tea, a capsule, a cream, and each of these forms should be from a different company. That's what we'd like you to try to do. So you're going to have 3 different formats of your herb from 3 different companies. And in the discussion board, we want you to list them And we want you to include any product claims that you can find on the packaging, the type of preparation, and any additives. That could be other herbs, it could be the alcohol of the tincture, it could be a beeswax or an oil that's in a cream, and any quality or safety considerations that are listed on the package. So this is really for you to get a breadth of product formats for your herb and to begin to look at how the product is labeled. So post that. I'll see you on the discussion board, and then I'll see you back in part 2 of this lecture. Okay, take care.